Hey, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. If you found this video, chances are you're someone who appreciates the kind of content that's genuinely hard to find these days, something slow, something real, something that gives your mind actual permission to rest. And that is exactly what we made this for. Over the next 100 minutes, we're taking you somewhere most people will never get to visit in person, a remote, centuries-old stone cottage on the edge of a wild Scottish Highland loch. No traffic. No notifications. No noise. Just mist rolling off dark glacial water at dawn, reed beds swaying in the morning air, and wild brown trout leaping from one of the cleanest, most ancient freshwater landscapes left on Earth. And along the way, we're going to share 100 genuinely fascinating facts about this world, the science, the history, the wildlife, and the culture of the Scottish Highlands, woven together into one continuous, unhurried story from sunrise all the way through to the first light of spring. Whether you're watching this to fall asleep, to decompress after a long day, to study, to meditate, or simply because you needed 60 minutes away from everything, you made a great choice. So go ahead and get comfortable. Put your phone down. Let your shoulders drop. The Scottish Highlands are waiting for you, and trust us, they are absolutely worth the trip. Let's go. There is a moment, just before dawn breaks over the Scottish Highlands, when the world holds its breath. The hills are dark still, great rounded shoulders of ancient rock draped in heather and silence, and the loch below them lies perfectly flat, perfectly still, as though it were made of pewter rather than water. No wind stirs. No bird calls yet. And from the surface of the water, something extraordinary begins to happen. A thin veil of mist lifts, slowly, almost shyly, curling upward in soft ribbons that catch what little light exists at this hour and turn it into something close to silver. This is the world of the Highland Lochside Cottage. And it has been waiting a very long time to tell you its story. That mist you see rising from the loch is not simply fog drifting in from elsewhere, it is born right there on the water's surface, and it forms because the loch itself retains warmth long after the surrounding air has cooled overnight. When the temperature of the air above drops below that of the water below, moisture evaporates upward and condenses almost immediately into those ghostly, wandering veils. The Scots have long called this kind of mist, the breath of the loch, and on a calm September morning, it is one of the most quietly astonishing things you will ever see. The cottage sits just back from the water's edge. It is a low, stone-built structure, its walls thick enough to lean against without feeling them give even slightly. Those walls were not built for ornament, they were built to endure, to press back against Atlantic gales that sweep in from the west and make the trees along the lochside bend in conversation with the ground. The cottage has been here for a long time. Longer, perhaps, than anyone still living can properly account for. Traditional Highland cottages, the kind that line remote lochsides from Loch Ness in the east to Loch Maree in the northwest, were historically built using a construction method called drystone walling for their outer shells, with walls sometimes reaching a thickness of 1 meter or more. This was not extravagance. It was physics. A wall of that depth acts as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during warmer hours and releasing it slowly through the night, keeping the interior surprisingly stable in temperature regardless of what drama the Highland weather was staging just outside. Step inside the cottage in your imagination. Come, it is early still, and the rest of the world is not yet awake, and you will find a low-ceilinged room where the hearth is already laid, ready for a match. The air smells of peat and old timber and something harder to name, a mineral, slightly earthy scent that belongs to places built close to deep water. A single window faces the loch, and through it, you can watch the mist continuing its morning performance without any obligation to do anything at all about it. The peat that would historically have burned in the hearth of a cottage like this one is not simply rotted vegetation, it is a compressed record of thousands of years of plant life, built up layer by layer in the boggy ground that surrounds much of the Highland landscape. A single block of peat burned on a fire might contain the botanical remains of plants that were alive during the Bronze Age. When it burns, it releases that ancient organic material back into the atmosphere as heat and the distinctively sweet, smoky fragrance that anyone who has ever spent time in the Scottish Highlands associates instinctively with the idea of shelter and warmth. Outside, the mist is beginning to move now. The first suggestion of dawn has appeared over the ridge to the east, not yet color, just a slightly lesser darkness, and the light it produces is enough to reveal the full extent of the loch for the first time. It is larger than the darkness suggested. It always is. Lochs in the Highlands have a way of being bigger than expected, as though they've been quietly expanding while no one was paying attention. The far shore is a dark line of conifers, their reflections broken only gently by the first breath of a morning breeze. And there, in the shallows directly in front of the cottage, the reeds begin. The common reed, Phragmites australis, is one of the most widely distributed plants on Earth, found on every continent except Antarctica, but in the Highland Loch environment it plays a role of particular ecological importance. Reed beds like those that fringe the shallow margins of many Scottish lochs serve as nurseries for juvenile fish, as nesting habitat for water birds, and as a natural water filtration system, their root networks absorbing excess nutrients and slowing the movement of sediment into the open water. A healthy stand of Lochside reeds is not merely decorative, it is infrastructure. The reeds are tall at this time of year, their seed heads gone to soft, reddish-brown plumes that move in the gentlest of breezes with a dry, papery whisper. That sound, the sound of reeds in a light wind, is one of those sounds that exists on the very edge of silence, close enough to quiet that it functions almost as a form of it. People who have spent time beside Lochside reed beds often describe the effect as deeply calming in a way that is difficult to articulate, as though the sound is doing something useful to the nervous system. There is science behind that feeling. Studies into natural soundscapes, a field sometimes called psychoacoustics, have found that soft, irregular, repetitive sounds produced by natural elements such as wind through reeds, rain on still water, or the movement of a slow river have a measurable effect on cortisol levels in the human body, reducing physiological markers of stress. The Highland Lochside, with its layered textures of water sound, reed movement, and bird call, produces a soundscape that is, in the most literal, biological sense, good for you. The light is growing now. The mist has not disappeared, it rarely disappears quickly, it tends to thin and reorganize, gathering in the lower hollows between the hills and retreating from the open water as the air temperature begins to rise, but it has changed character. Where it was silver before, it is becoming white. Where it was still, it is beginning to drift with the slow purposefulness of something that knows where it is going. A heron appears. It arrives without announcement, dropping out of the pale sky with that prehistoric, slightly improbable silhouette, all neck and legs and folded wings, and lands at the reed margin with barely a sound. It stands there without moving for a very long time, and this is entirely intentional. The grey heron, Ardea cinerea, is among the most patient hunters in the British natural world. It will stand motionless at the water's edge for periods of up to an hour, waiting for a fish to move within range of its bill, which it deploys with a striking speed measured at under half a second from stillness to impact. Herons are a consistent feature of the Highland Lochside throughout the year, and their presence around cottages is such a reliable fixture of the landscape that old Gaelic place names in the Highlands frequently reference them. The word cora, meaning heron, appears in dozens of Scottish geographical names. The heron does not move. The reeds whisper. The mist thins. And then the loch does something that, no matter how many mornings you watch it, still catches you by surprise. A trout leaps. It comes out of the water cleanly, perhaps 30 meters from the shore, arcing in a bright curve against the pale morning sky, and is gone again before the eye has quite finished registering that it happened. The rings it leaves spread outward in slow, perfect circles, reaching the reed margin and disappearing into the stems. The heron rotates its head precisely 4 degrees to the left. The mist drifts. Brown trout, Salmo truta, the species most commonly found in Highland lochs, leap from the water for several reasons, and the reasons change with the season. In summer and early autumn, a trout jumping at the surface is most often feeding on hatching insects, mayflies, caddisflies, midges, taking them at or just above the waterline in a behavior called surface feeding or rising. In other seasons, leaping may serve to dislodge external parasites, or may simply be a response to the fish's pursuit of prey near the surface. Whatever the cause, the sight of a trout breaking the mirror surface of a Highland loch at dawn is one of those small, perfect events that rewards patience in a way that feels disproportionate to its brevity. The morning is properly beginning now. The sky above the eastern ridge has moved through grey and is approaching something that might, cautiously, be called pale gold. The shapes of the hills are becoming distinct, their textures, rock, heather, bracken, the occasional rowan, separating themselves out of the general darkness. Closer to the cottage, a wren appears in the garden wall, makes a sound entirely too large for its body, and vanishes. The heron has given up on this particular section of shore and lifted itself back into the air with those slow, powerful wing beats that look effortful and somehow are not. The highland landscape that surrounds cottages like this one was shaped, in its fundamental character, by the last ice age, which ended approximately 11,700 years ago. The lochs themselves are largely the product of glacial action, ice sheets kilometers thick scoured out elongated basins in the bedrock over tens of thousands of years, and when they melted, those basins filled. Many highland lochs are extraordinarily deep as a result. Loch Morar, for instance, reaches a depth of 310 meters, making it the deepest freshwater body in the British Isles, its floor sitting below sea level despite being located several miles inland. The cold, clear water that fills these glacially carved basins is among the purest in Europe. The cottage is beginning to warm. Not from any heating, but from the day itself. The stone walls that stored the previous day's thin warmth are now releasing it back into the air, and the light through the single loch-facing window is falling on the flagstone floor in a rectangle that will move, incrementally, as the morning progresses, crossing the floor like a slow sundial. The flagstone floors found in many traditional Highland cottages were typically quarried from local slate or sandstone, and were laid directly onto compacted earth rather than concrete, a method that, counterintuitively, tends to remain drier underfoot than a sealed concrete base would. because moisture can move freely up and evaporate rather than being trapped and forced sideways. In parts of the Highlands, the craft of splitting and laying flagstone remained a locally practiced skill well into the 20th century, with knowledge passed from father to child in communities where quarrying was a part of the annual rhythm of work alongside fishing and crofting. Outside, the mist is almost gone. What remains of it has gathered into a long, low bank that lies across the loch about 2/3 of the way to the far shore, and it sits there with a kind of quiet authority, as though it has decided that this is where it will remain for the morning, regardless of what the sun has to say about it. The loch surface around it is clear and dark and full of reflected sky, pale blue now, with the first faint suggestion of cloud beginning to build over the western hills. Somewhere in the reeds, a sedge warbler begins to sing. It is an unsettled, improvisational sound, full of mimicked fragments of other birds' calls woven into a rambling, charming whole, a bird that sounds as though it is making it up as it goes along, which, in a sense, it is. The reed beds of Highland Loch support a remarkable diversity of bird life beyond the more visible species like heron and greylag geese. Among the less conspicuous but ecologically significant inhabitants is the reed bunting, Emberiza scuniclis, a small songbird whose population has become an indicator species for the health of wetland and riparian habitats across Scotland. Monitoring reed bunting numbers at Lochside sites gives conservationists a reliable proxy measure for the overall condition of the habitat, including water quality, invertebrate density, and the structural complexity of the reed bed itself. A loch with a healthy reed bunting population is, by most measures, a loch in good health. The morning is fully arrived now. The sky is blue and getting bluer. The mist has retreated to that long, stubborn bank across the water, and the loch is beginning to show its colors for the first time, the deep, slightly blue-green of cold, clear, peaty water, a color that exists almost nowhere else in the natural world and that photographs almost never quite capture correctly. The hills are purple and green and gold where the bracken has started to turn. The cottage, in the morning light, is the color of the stone itself, a warm, streaked gray that takes on the tones of whatever the sky above it is doing. This is where we are. This is where we begin. The story of the Highland Lochside Cottage is, in the end, a story about slowness, about a place and a way of life that have always moved at the pace of water, and mist, and the long patience of a heron at the reed margin. It is a story about deep cold and deep time and the particular quality of light on a northern loch on a morning in early autumn when there is nowhere else in the world that you would rather be. There are 90 more facts to come. But for now, listen. A trout is rising in the shallows. The reeds are whispering. And the mist, slowly, is beginning once more to lift. By mid-morning, the Highland Loch has made up its mind about the day. The tentative quality of the early hours, that sense of the landscape holding back, offering only hints and suggestions of itself, has given way to something more committed. The light is fuller now, falling at a lower angle than it will in summer, as autumn demands, and it catches the surface of the water differently than it did an hour ago. Where the loch was dark and still and mirror-flat at dawn, it is now moving in small, complex ways, responding to the breeze that has begun to come down off the hills from the northwest. The water is alive with tiny facets of reflected light, each one present for only a fraction of a second before the surface shifts and it is replaced by another. The mist has almost entirely retreated. That last, stubborn bank that held its position across the middle of the loch through the early morning has finally thinned to a translucence, and through it the far shore is now clearly visible, the dark wall of Scots pine and larch that lines the opposite bank reflected in the water below with such fidelity that the boundary between tree and reflection is almost impossible to locate precisely. It is one of those visual effects that the Highland Loch produces effortlessly and repeatedly, and it never quite loses its power to stop you in the middle of whatever you were doing and simply make you look. The water in a loch like this one is not simply cold and clear, it is chemically distinct from most freshwater found elsewhere in Britain. Highland lochs fed by streams running off peat moorland carry dissolved organic compounds that give the water a faint but unmistakable amber tint when viewed in a glass, though it appears dark from above. This coloration, caused by humic and fulvic acids leached from the peat, is entirely natural and does not affect the water's quality. In fact, many Highland lochs have historically served as sources of exceptionally clean drinking water for the communities that settled beside them. The peat acts as a slow, thorough filter, and the result is water of remarkable purity, cold even in the height of summer because the lochs are deep enough that solar warming reaches only the uppermost layers. A family of mallard have appeared from somewhere within the reed bed and are moving unhurriedly along the cottage shoreline, the female leading, the two young drakes behind her still wearing the dappled brown of their first-year plumage rather than the glossy bottle green they will carry through adulthood. They move without apparent urgency, occasionally appending to reach something beneath the surface, their tail feathers pointing skyward in the briefly comic posture that ducks adopt when feeding at depth. The reeds close behind them as they pass through a gap in the stems, and the sound of their paddling fades into the general texture of the morning. It is worth pausing here to consider the reed bed more carefully, because it is doing a great deal more than simply providing shelter for passing mallard. The stems themselves, which can reach a height of 3 meters in sheltered, nutrient-rich margins, grow from a root system called a rhizome network that spreads horizontally through the loch bed sediment, binding it and stabilizing the shoreline against the erosive action of wave energy during storms. Without this anchoring function, the soft margins of many Highland lochs would gradually be claimed back by the water, the rich transition zone between land and loch, the place where the greatest density of life tends to concentrate, simply disappearing into open water. The reed bed, in this sense, is the physical boundary that makes the Lochside habitable for dozens of species that depend on exactly that meeting point between two worlds. The breeze off the hills strengthens for a moment, and the reeds bend together in a long, sweeping movement that travels down the bed from north to south like a slow wave. The sound they make changes as they move, from the dry whisper of stem against stem to something fuller and more sibilant as the plumes at the top of each reed catch the air. Then the gust passes and they settle back, and the whisper returns, and the loch surface smooths again by a degree or two, and a trout rises in the shallows, leaving that familiar expanding ring on the water's face. This trout, or one very like it, may have been living in this loch for considerably longer than you might expect. Brown trout in cold, deep Highland lochs grow slowly, because the water temperature remains low enough through most of the year to keep their metabolism operating at a reduced rate and because food, in the form of invertebrates and small fish, is not always abundant in the relatively nutrient-poor waters of a peaty Highland loch. A trout that weighs 2 pounds in a rich, lowland chalk stream might be 3 years old. The same fish in a Highland loch might be 7 or 8. Specimens of 4 or 5 pounds, which would be unremarkable in a southern river, represent many years of careful, cold survival here, sometimes more than a decade of winters endured beneath ice, of summers spent in the deeper, cooler layers of water where temperature remains stable regardless of what is happening at the surface above. The cottage garden, if the rough, slightly wild patch of ground between the stone wall and the lochside can be called a garden without the word losing too much of its meaning, is showing the first colors of the autumn. Rowans heavy with orange berries lean over the wall at the eastern end. A patch of heather along the water's edge is still in its last purple flush. And in the damp, peaty soil closest to the reed margin, there are plants that have no formal relationship with anyone who has ever lived in the cottage. They arrived on their own terms, following their own logic, and they have stayed. Among them is bog bean, a plant whose name does it very little justice, with its delicate white flowers fringed like the edges of a lace curtain, and water mint, which releases its scent, sharp and clean and slightly medicinal, when brushed against. These marginal plants, growing in the zone between open water and dry land, have historically had a working relationship with the communities that settled beside Highland lochs. Water mint was used in folk medicine across the Highlands for generations as a remedy for stomach complaints, and bog bean was employed as a bittering agent in the brewing of ale before hops became widely available, giving early Highland brews a sharp, distinctive edge that they shared with similar beers made in Scandinavia and northern Germany. The light is shifting. A bank of cloud has come in from the west, not dramatically, not with any intent to cause trouble, but enough to soften the morning's hard-edged brightness into something more diffuse and gentle. Under this cloud-filtered light, the colors of the lochside change character. The hills across the water lose their individual detail and become broader, more painterly shapes of mauve and olive. The loch itself deepens in color, the amber tint of its peaty water becoming more visible now that the surface glare has gone. And the mist, gone, apparently, since mid-morning, shows a faint suggestion of returning. Not yet. But the conditions are shifting toward it. Mist in the Scottish Highlands is not a simple, binary thing, present or absent, on or off. It exists on a spectrum of density and movement and behavior that changes with every shift in temperature and wind, and the people who have lived alongside Highland lochs for generations have developed a nuanced, practical vocabulary for describing it. There is the light har that drifts in from the sea on still summer evenings. There is the hill fog that sits on the upper slopes and never quite descends to the water. There is the loch mist of early morning, self-generated and evanescent. And there is the deep, settled har of autumn and winter that can persist for days, muffling sound and compressing the visible world to a small circle of clarity and reducing the loch to a suggestion of itself, a dark shape heard rather than seen, marked by the sound of water against the shore and the occasional call of a bird somewhere out on its invisible surface. The sedge warbler that was singing earlier has fallen silent, its improvisational performance concluded for now. In its place, a single curlew passes overhead, its long, descending call trailing behind it as it goes, one of those sounds that contains, somehow, the entire emotional character of the Highland landscape in a single phrase. It is a sound that people either find hauntingly beautiful or deeply melancholy, and quite possibly it is both of these things at the same time. The cottage has warmed through the morning, and the stone walls that were cool to the touch at first light are now fractionally warm on the south-facing side, where the low autumn sun has been working at them steadily since it cleared the ridge. Inside, the air is different from the air outside, a little denser, a little older, carrying those layered scents of peat and timber and the faint mineral presence of stone that has been breathing the same air for a very long time. There is a particular quality of stillness that belongs to old Highland cottages on quiet autumn mornings, when the fire is not yet lit and the day outside is doing all the interesting things and the interior simply waits. It is not the stillness of emptiness. It is the stillness of accumulated time, of generations of mornings just like this one, absorbed into the walls and the floor and the low wooden beams overhead. It is, in the most literal sense possible, the feeling of a place that has been here long enough to develop a character of its own, independent of whoever happens to be living in it at any given moment. And through the window, untroubled by any of this reflection, the Loch continues its mourning. The mallard have reappeared further along the shore. The reeds are whispering their dry, patient whisper. And somewhere out in the dark water, moving with that slow, deliberate grace that cold water fish possess, a large brown trout is turning in a wide arc through the depths, heading toward the surface, almost ready to leap. The afternoon arrives in the Highlands the way it always does in autumn, earlier than expected, and with a quality of light that feels borrowed from somewhere further north. It is not the warm, horizontal gold of a summer afternoon. It is something cooler and more considered than that, a light that seems to come not just from the sun but from the landscape itself, as though the hills and the water have been storing it all morning and are now releasing it back into the air in a form that has been changed by the process. The Loch catches this light along its western shore and turns it into something that painters have been attempting to reproduce for centuries with only occasional success. The problem, most of them eventually conclude, is not the color, it is the movement. The way the light on the surface of a Highland loch in October refuses to stay still long enough to be faithfully recorded. The reeds along the cottage shore are doing something different in this light than they were this morning. Where they were soft and slightly indistinct in the diffuse cloud-filtered hours before noon, they are now sharp and backlit, each stem and plume catching the low western sun along one edge and throwing a thin line of gold against the darker mass of the bed behind it. The effect is of extraordinary intricacy, thousands of individually illuminated lines overlapping and crossing in a composition of such complexity that the eye moves through it without ever quite finding a place to settle. It is, as with so many things at the Lochside, most comfortably observed from peripheral vision rather than direct attention. The afternoon is also when the Loch begins to reveal what lives in it most openly. The morning belongs to birds. The afternoon, increasingly, belongs to the water itself, to the subtle signs of life beneath the surface that manifest as rings, as flashes of silver brown in shallow water, as the slow subsidence of a wake left by something moving just below the surface film. The trout are more active in these afternoon hours than they were through the middle of the day, when light penetration and water temperature conspire to push them deeper and quieter. Brown trout are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in barometric pressure, a fact that generations of Highland anglers have understood intuitively long before the science behind it was properly investigated. When pressure drops, as it does in advance of the Atlantic weather systems that roll in across the highlands from the west with such regularity, trout become noticeably more active and surface-oriented, feeding with an urgency that suggests they understand, at some physiological level, that conditions are about to change. Experienced loch fishermen have always read the fish as a weather forecast, watching the pattern of rises across the water's surface as carefully as any barometer, and finding it at least as reliable. A bank of cloud is building to the southwest, its upper edges catching the afternoon sun and turning bright white against the deep blue above. Below that white rim, the cloud is a heavy, layered gray, and it is moving at a pace that suggests it means to arrive before evening. This is not unusual. Highland weather systems move quickly across landscape that offers them very little friction, no cities, no dense belts of woodland, no significant elevations between the Atlantic coastline and the interior glens except for the hills themselves, which tend to deflect rather than stop the weather, channeling it along the valleys and down the glensides in ways that local people learn to read as reliably as signposts. The cottage, which faces west across the loch, has been through many thousands of these approaching cloud systems. Its walls, more than a meter thick on the western side, were built specifically for this conversation with Atlantic weather. The lime mortar that holds the stones together in a cottage of this age is not the hard, rigid cement of modern construction, it is a softer, more flexible material that allows the wall to breathe, permitting moisture to move through it slowly in both directions rather than being trapped inside the structure. This breathability is one of the reasons that old lime-mortared stone cottages in the Highlands have survived for centuries in conditions that would quickly compromise modern cavity wall construction. The wall works with the weather rather than against it, and the building endures. There is a particular smell that arrives with a Highland afternoon in advance of rain. It is not quite petrichor, that familiar scent of rain on dry earth, because the Highland ground is rarely dry enough for that specific alchemy to occur. It is something earthier and more complex, the smell of wet peat and water and something resinous drifting from the Scots pine on the far shore, carried across the loch on the freshening breeze. People who have spent time in the Highlands often describe this pre-rain scent as one of the most immediately transporting sensory experiences they know, a smell that can conjure an entire landscape from memory with a speed and completeness that no visual image quite manages. The Scots pine responsible for part of that resinous note across the water is not simply a tree that happens to grow in the Highlands. It is, in a meaningful sense, the Highland landscape's oldest surviving native species, a relic of the ancient Caledonian forest that once covered much of Scotland after the last glaciation and that has been in almost continuous retreat since human settlement began clearing the land for farming and fuel some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The trees that line the far shore of a Highland loch today are, in many cases, direct descendants of that original post-glacial forest, regenerating slowly in places where grazing pressure has been reduced enough to allow seedlings to survive. They are, without drama, one of the oldest continuous living presences in the British Isles. Back on the near shore, the reeds have begun to respond to the freshening breeze. The movement that passes through them now is more vigorous than the gentle swaying of the morning, it is a proper bend, a sustained lean into the wind that reveals, briefly, the pale undersides of the leaves before the gust passes and they spring back. The sound they make has changed accordingly, taking on a rushing, hissing quality that sits at a higher register than their usual whisper. In strong autumn winds, a large reed bed produces a sound that is genuinely loud, a sustained, complex roar that carries across open water, and this capacity for noise is part of why dense reed beds offer such effective cover for nesting birds. The sound masks everything within. The coot that has been working the edge of the reed bed all afternoon, diving repeatedly in a slightly frantic rhythm that looks exhausting to watch, pauses on the surface and regards the approaching cloud with apparent neutrality. Coots are among the most argumentative birds on any Highland loch, famously territorial and given to spectacular chases across the water's surface when a rival approaches their claimed stretch of shoreline, but in moments of apparent reflection they have a stillness about them that is almost comical in its intensity. This one sits without moving for a long moment, its white bill and forehead shield bright against the darkening water, before diving again with that characteristic forward lunge and disappearing cleanly beneath the surface. In the shallows just beyond the outermost reed stems, where the bottom shelves gradually from mud to sand to the small, rounded stones of the deeper margins, the water is clear enough to see the loch floor. The stones down there are covered in a thin, dark coating of algae and diatoms, microscopic photosynthetic organisms that form the absolute base of the loch's food chain, feeding the invertebrates that feed the juvenile fish that feed the larger trout and the herons and the ospreys that visit in summer from their African wintering grounds. The entire visible abundance of the Lochside, every bird, every fish, every web of ecological relationship, rests ultimately on those invisible, unremarkable films of microscopic life on the bottom stones. The cloud has reached the western hills now and is beginning to pour over their tops in the way that cloud does in the Highlands, not falling, exactly, but descending in a slow cascade that follows the shape of the hillside and gathers in the hollows. As it does, it produces a localized mist along the upper slopes that is distinct from the loch mist of early morning, denser and less luminous, sitting heavily on the land rather than rising from water. Where the morning mist was silver and evanescent, this is gray and purposeful. It means to stay. And then, as if to mark the transition from afternoon to something more complicated, a large trout leaps at the center of the loch, further from shore than any of the previous rises today, far enough out that the sound of its re-entry into the water reaches the cottage a half-second after the visual event, a small, clean slap carried across the darkening surface by the wind. The rings spread outward and are quickly absorbed by the chop that the breeze has raised. And the loch closes over the moment as cleanly as if it had never happened. But it did happen. And the cottage, with its thick walls and its loch-facing window and its long memory for afternoons just like this one, registered it in its quiet way and added it to everything else it knows. The rain will arrive within the hour. The fire will be lit. And the mist, always the mist, is already beginning to think about returning. The rain arrives without apology, as Highland rain tends to do. It does not build gradually from a few tentative drops to something more serious, the way rain sometimes does in more temperate, better-mannered parts of the country. It arrives all at once, a full and committed downpour that sweeps across the loch from the southwest in a moving curtain of gray, erasing the far shore completely before it reaches the near side and drums onto the cottage roof with a sound that is, despite everything, deeply satisfying. This is the rain that the thick walls were built for. This is the rain that the lime mortar was designed to negotiate. The cottage receives it with the equanimity of long experience, and inside, nothing changes except that the window becomes a streaming abstraction of grey and silver where the loch used to be. The loch itself undergoes an immediate and dramatic transformation in heavy rain. The surface, which has been a complex, wind-riffled plane of reflected light and shadow all afternoon, becomes something entirely different, a field of tiny craters, each raindrop impact sending up a momentary crown of water before collapsing back into the general turbulence, and each one producing a ring that overlaps with 10,000 others in a pattern of such complexity that it defeats any attempt at focus. The effect is of the loch's surface becoming simultaneously busier and more opaque, sealed off from above and below alike, a closed system of water on water. The rain that falls into a Highland loch is not simply adding volume to it. It is changing its chemistry in small but measurable ways. Rainwater in the Highlands, falling through air that comes largely from the Atlantic and carries very little industrial pollution compared to the air over more densely populated parts of Europe, is exceptionally soft, low in dissolved minerals, slightly acidic from absorbed carbon dioxide, and carrying trace amounts of sea salt in coastal areas where the prevailing westerlies have passed over open ocean before reaching land. When this soft, slightly acidic rainwater meets the already peaty, organically rich water of a Highland loch, the interaction influences everything from the availability of nutrients to the pH conditions that determine which invertebrate species can thrive in a given stretch of water. The chemistry of rain is, in this way, part of the biography of the loch. Inside the cottage, the fire is lit. This is not a complicated process. The previous occupant, following custom, has left the hearth laid with paper and kindling and a block of dried peat, so it is a matter of a single match and a brief, attentive period of coaxing before the fire takes hold and begins to produce the particular quality of warmth that only a peat fire can generate. It is not a fierce heat. It is a slow, deep, pervasive warmth that seems to come from the walls themselves once the fire has been burning for an hour, as though the stone has been waiting for permission to give back what it has been holding all day. The smell of burning peat fills the room, that ancient, sweet, slightly smoky fragrance, and the cottage becomes, in the space of a few minutes, a completely different proposition from the cool, quiet space it was an hour ago. The hearth at the center of a traditional Highland cottage was historically far more than a source of heat. In many older Highland dwellings, the black houses, or Tegian Dubba, that were the dominant form of rural architecture across the Hebrides and parts of the mainland Highlands until well into the 20th century, the central hearth had no chimney at all. Smoke from the peat fire was left to find its own way through a hole in the roof or simply to permeate the thatch, which it did with the useful side effect of waterproofing and preserving the organic roofing material. The interior walls were darkened by generations of accumulated smoke, hence the name, and the air inside, though undeniably smoky, was found by early researchers to be remarkably free of the airborne bacteria and mold spores that might otherwise have thrived in the damp Highland climate. Out in the reed bed, the rain is doing something that would be fascinating to watch from close range, if proximity were possible without a boat and a complete indifference to personal comfort. The reed stems, being hollow, a structural adaptation that gives them both strength and flexibility in the wind, collect and channel rainwater downward in small, internal streams that travel inside each stem to the root system below. This internal water transport, combined with the capillary action of the rhizome network in the saturated loch bed sediment, means that reeds in heavy rain are engaged in a complex two-directional movement of water, drawing it upward from the ground through their root systems even as they channel rainwater downward through their hollow stems. It is a hydraulic system of considerable elegance, operating silently and invisibly inside a plant that most people walk past without a second glance. The brown trout in the loch are responding to the rain in ways that vary by depth and size. Near the surface, where the downpour is creating turbulence and aerating the water, smaller fish have largely retreated to calmer, deeper levels where the rain's disruption does not reach. But the largest trout, the old, experienced fish that have spent many years in this loch and have learned to exploit every shift in conditions, may actually be active and feeding in the margins, where the rain washing off the surrounding land carries invertebrates and organic material into the water in a concentrated pulse of nutrition. The edges of a Highland loch during heavy rain are, for a large, opportunistic brown trout, something not unlike a well-laid table. The rain, as it runs off the hillsides and through the peat bogs above the loch, picks up not only the tannic compounds that give Highland water its characteristic color but also carries dissolved iron from the mineral-rich glacial soils of the upper slopes. This iron, arriving in the loch in small but continuous quantities with every rainfall, is an important micronutrient for the aquatic plants and algae that form the foundation of the loch's food web. The relationship between the surrounding landscape and the loch is, in this way, one of constant material exchange, the hills feeding the water moderating the climate of the hills, and the rain acting as the agent of transfer between them. A Highland loch is not a self-contained system. It is a conversation between everything around it. The fire has settled into its working rhythm now, a steady, low burn that requires occasional attention but not constant management. The peat glows rather than flames, its surface a landscape of orange and dark red embers with occasional blue flames where gases escape from the material as it slowly converts itself to heat. Outside, the rain continues without any sign of shortening its visit. The mist presses against the window glass. The loch is heard more than seen, the sound of water falling on water, that particular soft roar, filling the space between the cottage and the far shore. In the reed bed, a moorhen picks its way along a partially submerged stem, its head moving in that characteristic forward and back rhythm that looks mechanical but is actually a visual stabilization technique, allowing the bird to maintain a clear image of its environment even as its body moves. It reaches the end of the stem, considers the rain-agitated water below it for a moment with the focused attention of a creature for whom every decision is consequential, and steps off into the shallows without ceremony. The afternoon is deepening. The rain is making the light go early, compressing what would have been another hour of gray autumn afternoon into something closer to dusk, the mist and cloud above the loch thickening the air to the point where objects on the far shore, briefly visible between squalls, are now entirely gone. The cottage, its fire burning and its walls holding the weather at arm's length, draws its boundaries a little tighter and settles in. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing that cannot wait. The rain says so. The mist agrees. And somewhere beneath the dark, rain-pocked surface of the loch, turning slowly in the cold and the quiet deep below the storm, the trout carry on as they always have, patient, unhurried, entirely at home in a world that is mostly water. Dusk in the Highlands does not fall so much as it gathers. It begins at the edges, in the hollows between hills, in the spaces beneath the reed stems where the water is shallowest, in the gap between the cottage eaves and the loch surface where the light has always been thinnest even at noon. From these margins, darkness accumulates slowly inward, filling the landscape the way water fills a vessel, from the bottom up, from the outside in, from the places of least resistance toward the places that held the light longest. The loch's surface is always the last to go. Even when the hills behind the cottage have become simple dark shapes against a darkening sky, and the reed bed has lost all internal detail and become a single mass of blackish brown, the loch itself retains a faint luminosity, a pale, pewter gleam that seems to come from within the water rather than from any light source above it. The rain has eased in the last half hour, dropping from its afternoon intensity to a light, persistent drizzle that barely disturbs the loch's surface. The mist, which the heavy rain had pressed down into a thick, featureless blanket across the water, is now beginning to reorganize itself in the shifting, unpredictable way that mist does when the energy that was holding it in place begins to dissipate. It moves in slow, irregular masses, thickening here, thinning there, and in the gaps between these masses, the dark water appears briefly, its surface almost still again now that the wind has dropped. Then the mist closes over it once more, and the loch disappears again, and the evening proceeds in this intermittent way, the landscape revealing and concealing itself in a rhythm that feels almost deliberate. The behavior of mist over a Highland loch in the evening hours is influenced by something that most observers would never think to consider: the thermal structure of the water column beneath it. Highland lochs in autumn develop a pronounced stratification between their warmer surface layers, which have absorbed solar energy through the summer months, and their cold, deep bottom waters, which remain near freezing year-round regardless of season. This stratification, known as the thermocline, acts as an invisible boundary within the loch, above which temperature, oxygen levels, and biological activity are relatively high, and below which conditions become progressively colder, darker, and less hospitable to most forms of life. As evening cooling begins to break down the surface layer's warmth, the thermocline shifts, and the resulting changes in surface water temperature directly influence the rate of evaporation that produces and sustains the evening mist. A curlew calls somewhere beyond the northern end of the reed bed, one long, descending note and then silence. In the Gaelic tradition of the Highlands, the curlew's call was considered among the most emotionally significant of all bird sounds, associated in oral poetry and song with longing, with distance, and with the particular quality of sadness that belongs to beautiful, empty places. The Gaelic word for the curlew, gilgneach, appears in some of the oldest surviving Scottish poetry, and the bird's call was understood not as a simple biological signal but as a kind of articulation of what the landscape itself might say if it had the faculty of speech. It is one of those cases where an entire culture's relationship with its environment is compressed into a single word and the sound it describes. The fire inside the cottage has been burning for several hours now and has transformed the interior completely. The flagstone floor, which was cool and slightly damp at midday, is warm underfoot. The low timber beams overhead have absorbed the heat rising from the hearth and are radiating it back down in a gentle, even warmth that fills the room from above as well as from the fireside. The smell of the peat has deepened and changed as the fire has matured. The initial sharp, slightly acrid note of fresh peat catching has given way to something richer and more rounded, a smell with genuine complexity, the way a good stock changes character as it reduces on a stove. The curlew calls once more from somewhere further away this time, its note flattening and lengthening as it travels through the mist-thickened air before disappearing entirely into the dark. The cottage absorbs the sound the way it absorbs everything, without comment, without judgment, with the patient indifference of a thing that has been listening to this lochside for a very long time and finds nothing in it, even now, that surprises. The night is almost here. The mist is rising from the water with renewed purpose, building in slow layers above the invisible surface of the loch, and the Highland dark, which is a darker dark than most people raised in lit places have ever experienced, is filling the spaces between the hills with its old, complete, unhurried authority. The trout, one final time, leaps. The sound of it carries through the mist and reaches the cottage wall and is gone. The otter that lives along this section of shore does its most productive hunting in precisely these dark hours. Otters on Highland lochs are largely nocturnal in their activity patterns, spending the daylight hours resting in holts, underground chambers dug into the bank, often beneath the root systems of waterside trees or in the spaces within dense reed rhizome networks, and emerging at dusk to hunt through the night. This one has been working the margins of the reed bed for the past hour, hunting in the unhurried, methodical way of a predator that knows its territory intimately. It dives repeatedly in shallow water, using its whiskers, which are extraordinarily sensitive to the pressure waves created by moving fish, as its primary hunting instrument in conditions where even its excellent low-light vision is insufficient. The whiskers of an otter are, in darkness, more effective than eyes. Highland otters are members of the Eurasian otter species Lutra, which in Scotland has its stronghold population precisely in these remote lochside habitats where water quality is high, fish populations are healthy, and human disturbance is minimal. The Scottish otter population represents a significant proportion of the entire European population of the species, which declined dramatically across most of the continent through the 20th century due to river pollution, hunting, and the loss of bankside habitat. The recovery of otters in the Highlands since legal protection was introduced in 1981 is one of the more quietly encouraging wildlife conservation stories in Britain, and the presence of an otter working the margins of a Highland loch at night is not incidental to the health of that loch, it is a confirmation of it. The trout are not resting. This is one of the facts about fish that surprises people most reliably, the discovery that fish do not sleep in the way that mammals and birds do. They have no eyelids to close, no REM cycle to complete, no evident period of full unconsciousness. What they have instead are periods of reduced activity and lowered metabolic rate that serve some of the restorative functions of sleep, during which they tend to hold position in the water column with minimal fin movement, often near the loch bed or in sheltered areas of the margins. Brown trout in a Highland loch at night typically adopt this resting state in the deeper, cooler water away from the shore, hovering with that effortless, almost sculptural stillness that fish achieve, and then, periodically, moving again, shifting position, responding to some stimulus that is too subtle for any instrument but the fish's own lateral line to detect. The lateral line itself is one of nature's more remarkable sensory achievements, a system of fluid-filled canals running along both sides of the fish's body, opening to the exterior through a series of pores visible as a faint line along the flank, that detects minute changes in water pressure and movement. It allows a trout in complete darkness, at the bottom of a Highland loch at 2 in the morning, to perceive the movement of a small invertebrate several body lengths away, to know, without seeing, that something is there. It is a sense for which humans have no direct equivalent and no particularly adequate language, being neither touch nor hearing but something that shares properties with both. The fire in the cottage has gone to ash. The last of the peat's heat is radiating from the hearthstone in a warmth that will persist for another hour or two before the room begins to cool toward the temperature of the stone walls. Outside, the clear sky is accelerating the ground-level cooling. A clear night in autumn loses heat rapidly by radiation into the upper atmosphere, and by 3 in the morning the temperature beside the loch will have dropped to within a degree or two of freezing. The dew on the reed stems will thicken toward frost. The mist lying on the water's surface will deepen and spread as the differential between water temperature and air temperature increases through the coldest hours. And somewhere along the southern margin of the reed bed, the otter surfaces with a small trout in its jaws, climbs onto a flat stone at the water's edge, and eats in the dark with the focused efficiency of a creature that has been doing this for millions of years. The stars move overhead in their slow rotation. The loch holds its mirror of diffused starlight beneath the mist. The cottage stands in the dark and the cold and the silence and waits, without impatience, for what it has always known is coming. The dawn. And with it, the mist rising again from the water, new and familiar at once, as though the night had never happened. The second dawn arrives the way the first one did, and the way every dawn before it has arrived at this Lochside for as long as there has been a Lochside to arrive at. It begins not with light but with sound. The absolute silence of the deep night hours begins to acquire texture somewhere in the hour before first light, a robin, impossibly early, testing a few notes from somewhere within the garden wall before thinking better of it and falling quiet again. Then a brief pause, as though the darkness is considering the interruption. Then, gradually, from somewhere across the water, the first proper bird song of the morning, a single wren, its volume entirely disproportionate to its size, filling the pre-dawn air with a cascade of notes that carries across the still surface of the loch with extraordinary clarity. Sound travels differently in the cold, mist-laden air of a Highland dawn, faster and further than it would in warmer, drier conditions, the dense, moisture-heavy atmosphere acting as a more efficient conductor than the lighter air of midday. This acoustic property of cold, moist air is not simply a matter of atmospheric physics, though it is that. It is also a feature of the Highland soundscape that has been understood and implicitly relied upon by the communities that have lived beside these lochs for centuries. Sound carrying across still water on a calm morning could serve as an early warning system, an aid to navigation in mist, and a means of communication across distances that would be impractical in other conditions. The calls of birds at dawn, the sound of oars on water, the bark of a dog at a distant cottage, all of these traveled further and more clearly in the cold morning air above a Highland loch than the same sounds would in almost any other environment in the British Isles. The frost that formed in the coldest hours before dawn has left a thin white film on every horizontal surface, the flat stones along the cottage wall, the broader reed leaves at the margin, the wooden sill of the loch-facing window. It is a light frost, the kind that the first hour of sunlight will dissolve completely, but it has changed the appearance of the Lochside in subtle ways, softening the edges of things and giving the reeds a slightly crystalline quality in the first pale light. Each frost crystal on a reed leaf formed around a microscopic nucleus, a particle of dust, a fragment of organic material, a salt crystal carried on the night air, the ice building outward from that point in the precise hexagonal lattice structure that the hydrogen bonds and water molecules impose on every ice crystal, everywhere on Earth, without exception. The snowflake's six-sided symmetry and the frost crystal's branching geometry are not decorative choices. They are the inescapable mathematical consequence of how water molecules bond to one another at temperatures below freezing. The mist this morning is denser than yesterday's. The cold night has loaded the air above the loch with moisture, and as the faint warmth of first light begins to create the temperature differential between water and air that drives loch mist formation, the result is a surface layer of extraordinary density and whiteness, not the thin, wispy veils of a mild autumn morning but a solid-looking blanket of vapor that sits perhaps 2 meters deep above the loch surface, its upper edge almost flat, as though something has been laid carefully across the water. The far shore has completely disappeared within it. The reed bed vanishes into its nearest edge. Only the topmost plumes of the tallest reeds project above the mist layer, and they do so in a way that is, in the low, raking light of the earliest dawn, genuinely arresting, a line of dark, feathery shapes floating in white above a world that no longer seems to have a surface. The cottage is cold. The hearth holds the grey ash of last night's fire, and the stone walls, which retained warmth through the earlier part of the night, have now given back everything they had and are back to their baseline temperature, cool, slightly damp on the interior surface, with that mineral smell that cold stone produces which is distinct from the smell of the same stone warmed. A Highland cottage in the hour before the fire is relit is not an uncomfortable place, precisely, but it is an unambiguous one. It communicates clearly and without sentiment that the warmth of yesterday was not a permanent condition but a daily achievement, to be renewed each morning from the hearth outward. The practice of building and maintaining a peat fire was, in traditional Highland communities, governed by customs and superstitions that reflected the central importance of the hearth to the survival and continuity of the household. In many parts of the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and Islands, it was customary to smouring the fire at night, a practice of covering the embers with ash in a specific, ritualized way to preserve them through the cold hours, so that the fire was never fully extinguished but merely banked, ready to be revived in the morning. The Gaelic prayer associated with smouring, recorded in Alexander Carmichael's 19th-century collection Carmina Gadelica, addresses the fire as a living presence in the house, its preservation through the night a matter of both practical necessity and spiritual significance. The idea that the hearth fire should never fully die, that its continuity connected the household to something older and more permanent than any individual generation, ran deep in Highland domestic culture. The light is strengthening now, arriving in that gradual, reluctant Highland way that differs from the decisive dawns of southern latitudes. By the time it is bright enough to see clearly across the cottage garden to the reed margin, the frost on the flat stones is already retreating, the ice crystals dissolving back into liquid water as the air temperature rises by fractions of a degree with each passing minute. The reed leaves, which carried their frost coating with a kind of dignified stillness through the cold night, are beginning to drip. Small droplets form at the tip of each leaf and fall into the water below with a sound too quiet to hear from the cottage but visible as the faintest of disturbances on the mist-covered surface. The otter, which spent the night hunting along the loch margins, has returned to its holt as the light increased. Otters in occupied Lochside territories follow predictable patterns of nocturnal activity and daytime rest that are so consistent that a careful observer, returning to the same stretch of shore over several days, can begin to predict not only when the animal will emerge but which sections of the shoreline it will work in what sequence. The spraints, scent markings deposited on prominent rocks and reed stem bases along the shore, that the otter left during its night's hunting are visible in the early light as small, dark, slightly oily deposits with the distinctive musky, almost sweet smell that otter spraints carry and that functions as a detailed chemical message to any other otter that investigates it. The message contains information about the depositing animal's identity, sex, reproductive status, and the recency of its visit, a newspaper left on a stone for the next reader. In the deeper water of the loch, something is happening that will become visible at the surface within the next hour. The brown trout that spent the night in the cooler, deeper layers of the water column are beginning their ascent toward the surface as the light increases, responding to the activity of aquatic invertebrates that are themselves responding to the light and the slight warming of the surface layer. This daily vertical migration, fish moving up through the water column in the morning and down again toward midday heat, is one of the fundamental rhythms of life in a stratified Highland loch, as predictable as the tides and as ecologically consequential. It is the mechanism that connects the rich surface zone, where light and photosynthesis drive productivity, to the deeper zones where fish spend their resting hours, transferring energy between layers of the water column in a continuous daily cycle. The Scots pine on the far shore, invisible since last evening within the mist, is beginning to reappear as the uppermost part of the mist layer thins in the first direct light. The trees emerge from the white knot gradually but suddenly. They are not there, and then they are, their dark forms appearing above the mist like something surfacing from below. The resinous scent they produce, carried across the water on the barely perceptible morning air movement, reaches the cottage side before the trees themselves are fully visible. The volatile terpene compounds that give Scots pine its characteristic fragrance are released most abundantly in the temperature fluctuations of early morning, when the sudden warming of the needles after a cold night accelerates the evaporation of these aromatic compounds into the air. It is a smell that functions almost as a biological clock. The scent of pine in cool morning air is one of the most precisely time-specific sensory experiences the Highland Lochside offers. The wren has resumed its extravagant performance from the garden wall, and a pair of golden-eyed ducks have materialized on the open water at the near edge of the mist, diving ducks, here for the autumn and winter, their black and white plumage sharp and formal-looking in the early light. They dive with a compact, forward-rolling action and stay under for longer than seems plausible, surfacing each time in a slightly different position, the male shaking the water from his head with the brisk efficiency of someone who has important business to attend to. The loch is opening up around them as the mist continues to thin, the day's geography reassembling itself piece by piece from the white. The fire is laid. The match is struck. The first small flame takes hold in the kindling and the cottage begins, once again, its daily process of becoming warm. The peat smoke rises from the chimney and drifts south across the garden in the light morning air, thinning as it goes, and the smell of it joins the smell of frost and pine and cold water and the faint mineral note of wet stone, the full, complex fragrance of a Highland Lochside morning, which is like no other smell on earth and which anyone who has known it once will spend the rest of their life, in some quiet, persistent part of themselves, trying to find again. The mist is lifting. The trout are rising. And the day, unhurried and entirely itself, is beginning. There is a specific moment in the Highland autumn when the season tips from its earlier, gentler phase into something more serious. It happens at different times in different years, and it is not marked by any single event, not the first frost, not the first storm, not the day the last swallow leaves. It is more like a shift in the quality of the light, a change in the angle and color of the sun that alters the character of every hour of the day simultaneously and makes it clear, in a way that no calendar could quite convey, that the year is now moving with genuine purpose toward its darkest point. The hills, which were purple and gold and green through September and into October, have become predominantly brown. The bracken that covers their lower slopes has dried to a deep, warm rust that looks almost luminous in low sunlight but is, undeniably, a dying color. The rowans have dropped their berries, or had them stripped by fieldfares and redwings arriving from Scandinavia. And the Loch, which changes character with every season as reliably as any living thing, has taken on its winter appearance, darker, deeper looking, more opaque, as though it has drawn a curtain across whatever it holds beneath. The reed bed has transformed most dramatically of all the Lochside features. Through summer and into early autumn the reeds stood at their full height, green-stemmed and vigorous, their seed heads a rich reddish-brown above the living green mass below. Now the green is entirely gone, replaced by the pale, bleached straw color of dead stems, and the bed has thinned slightly as the weakest stems have collapsed under their own weight or been laid down by the recent storms. What remains is a structure of considerable beauty in a stripped-back, architectural way, the standing stems catching the low autumn light along their pale lengths, the fallen ones creating a dense, interwoven mat at the water's surface that provides a different kind of habitat from the standing stems, lower, more sheltered, accessible to species that find the vertical world of the upright reed bed too exposed. The ecological value of dead reed material, the standing dead stems and the fallen litter accumulating at the water's edge, is, if anything, greater than that of the living plant. Reed stems that have died but remain standing provide nesting sites for solitary bees and other cavity-nesting insects, whose larvae overwinter in the hollow tubes in numbers that would be remarkable if the stems were opened and examined. The fallen reed litter at the water margin, decomposing slowly in the cold water, releases nutrients in a controlled, time-released way that would be impossible to replicate artificially, and provide structural habitat for the invertebrate communities on which the loch's fish and birds depend through the lean months of winter. A reed bed is at its most ecologically productive not when it is at the height of its summer growth but in the long, slow process of dying and decomposing that follows. The golden-eyed ducks that arrived at the start of the segment are now established fixtures of the morning loch. They have been joined by a small group of tufted ducks, black and white birds with the surprised-looking tuft of feathers at the back of the head that gives the species its name, and together these two diving species work the open water in front of the cottage with the systematic efficiency of birds that know they have a finite season in which to build the fat reserves that will carry them through the winter. Diving ducks, unlike the surface-feeding mallard and teal, pursue their food entirely underwater, using their feet as propulsion and steering with their wings folded against their bodies in a streamlined posture that bears more resemblance to a swimming mammal than to a bird in flight. The golden-eye in particular is an exceptionally capable diver, able to reach depths of several meters and remain submerged for up to 30 seconds, hunting the mollusks, crustaceans, and aquatic insects that live on and within the loch bed. The loch in late autumn holds a different population of fish from the one it contained in summer. The Arctic char, a species closely related to the brown trout and sharing the same glacially carved Highland lochs, descends from the deeper water where it spends the summer and begins to move toward the shallows as its spawning season approaches. Arctic char and Scottish Highland lochs are among the most genetically isolated fish populations in Britain. In some lochs, char populations have been separated from those in adjacent catchments for 10,000 years or more, since the retreat of the glaciers rearranged the drainage patterns of the landscape and severed the connections between water bodies. In that time, each isolated population has diverged slightly in form, coloration, and behavior from its neighbors, to the point where some highland lochs contain char that are found nowhere else on Earth, species locked into their particular loch as completely as an island species is locked into its island. The light this morning has a quality that is hard to describe without reference to color. It is a low, golden light of the kind that only appears when the sun is at its autumn angle, rising barely above the southern horizon even at midday, and it illuminates the loch side with an almost theatrical intensity that makes familiar things look unfamiliar. The reed stems, bleached pale gold by the season, glow in this light with a warmth that the living green plant never had. The surface of the loch, where it is visible beyond the mist that still lies along the margins, catches the sun in long, low glints that travel toward the cottage in lines rather than points, the characteristic signature of low-angle light on gently moving water. And the hills above the far shore, lit from the south and east at this hour, show every fold and wrinkle of their ancient surface in a detail that the higher, flatter light of summer never reveals. The cottage in late autumn settles into a different relationship with its environment than it maintains through the lighter months. The days are now short enough that the fire is lit not just in the evenings but through most of the day, and the character of the interior, the smell, the texture of the air, the degree of warmth, becomes more consistent and self-referential, less dependent on what the weather outside is doing from hour to hour. This is the season for which the thick walls were most specifically built, not to exclude summer warmth, which the Highlands rarely produces in excess, but to buffer the interior against the sustained cold of a Highland winter, maintaining a habitable temperature with the minimum possible expenditure of fuel. A well-built stone cottage with a competently managed peat fire can maintain a comfortable interior temperature in conditions that would defeat a modern, lightly constructed building, because the mass of the walls acts as a thermal flywheel, smoothing out the fluctuations in fire intensity and ambient temperature into a steady, even warmth. At the water's edge, the alders that line the cottage shore north of the reed bed are doing something that seems, at first glance, counterintuitive for a tree in autumn. They are feeding the loch. As their leaves fall into the water, they carry a cargo of fixed nitrogen that is disproportionately high compared to the leaves of most other native tree species. Alder trees are one of the very few temperate broadleaved species capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that colonize their root nodules, the same biological process, adapted for a tree rather than a legume, that makes clover valuable in pasture management. The nitrogen-rich leaves that alder sheds into lochside water in autumn represent a genuine nutrient subsidy to the loch ecosystem, boosting the productivity of the aquatic food web at precisely the point in the year when other nutrient inputs are at their lowest. The mist is behaving differently in late autumn than it did in the milder weeks of early October. The greater temperature differential between the cooling air and the loch water, which retains its summer heat longer than the surrounding land, means that mist forms more readily and persists longer as the season advances. On still, cold mornings like this one, it is not unusual for the loch mist to remain until mid-morning or later, slowly thinning as the air warms by imperceptible degrees, retreating to the margins and the sheltered bays where the water is warmest relative to the air above it. In the deepest autumn and into winter, the mist can persist all day in the most sheltered glens, the loch never fully revealing itself, maintaining its privacy behind a veil of vapor that the weak sun cannot fully dissolve. On these days, the presence of the loch is primarily acoustic, the sound of water, of wind on water, of birds calling from its invisible surface, rather than visual, and there is something in this reduction of the landscape to its sounds that focuses attention on details that daylight habitually obscures. A red deer stag has appeared on the hillside above the far shore, a dark shape against the pale grass of the upper slope, antlers clearly visible even at this distance. Stags in the Highland rut have been moving since early October, but by now the rutting season is winding down and the exhausted animals are beginning to think about recovery rather than competition. A stag that has spent 3 weeks of October without eating properly, covering vast distances in pursuit of hinds and in challenge of rival males, may have lost a fifth or more of its body weight by the end of the rut, and the weeks of late autumn before the hardest weather arrives are critical for rebuilding the fat reserves that will determine whether it survives the winter. This particular stag stands on the skyline for a long moment, reading the wind that comes off the loch toward the hill, then turns and walks with the unhurried purposefulness of a large animal that has somewhere to be, disappearing over the ridge in 3 or 4 strides and leaving the hillside empty again. The trout have not forgotten what they are. Even in this late season, with the water temperature dropping toward the point where their metabolism will slow significantly and their feeding will become intermittent, a good hatch of late autumn midges on a calm afternoon will bring them to the surface in the old, familiar way, rings spreading on the dark water, the occasional full leap, the loch momentarily alive with the evidence of feeding fish before the cold settles back and the surface closes over. It is as though the trout, like the cottage itself, like the reeds and the mist and the curlew's call drifting across the water, are doing what they have always done and will continue to do, regardless of the season or the cold or the shortening of the days. The loch endures. The mist rises and falls and rises again. And the cottage, its fire burning low in the late morning quiet, holds its place at the water's edge as it always has, patient, purposeful, entirely at home in a landscape that has been shaping it and shaped by it for longer than any record of either survives to tell. Winter does not announce itself in the Highlands with any particular ceremony. There is no single morning on which you wake and know, with absolute certainty, that the season has formally changed, no hard boundary between the last of autumn and the first of winter, no line in the landscape that you can point to and say, here, this is where one ended and the other began. What there is instead is a gradual accumulation of evidence. The days that are noticeably shorter than the ones before them. The mornings on which the frost does not entirely leave the north-facing stones of the cottage wall even by midday. The quality of the silence, which deepens as the season advances in a way that is difficult to quantify but impossible to miss, a silence that is not merely the absence of sound but the presence of cold, as though cold itself has a texture that fills the air between things and makes the world quieter simply by occupying more of it. The loch this morning is the stillest it has been since the first segment of this story began. There is no wind at all. The surface is a perfect, unbroken plain of dark water, and in its reflection the sky above is reproduced with such completeness that the boundary between the real sky and its image in the water is visible only at the point where the reed stems enter the frame at the bottom of the reflected sky and interrupt the illusion. The mist is present but minimal, thin wisps at the margins where the water is shallowest and the temperature differential most pronounced, and the visibility across the loch is the best it has been in days. The far shore is sharp and clear, the Scots pines dark against the pale morning sky, the hillside above them carrying the first light dusting of snow on the uppermost slopes. That snow on the high ground above the loch is not merely a visual feature of the winter landscape, it is an active component of the loch's hydrology. As snow accumulates on the Highland hills through winter and then melts in the warming weeks of late winter and early spring, it releases water into the catchment in a slow, sustained pulse that is fundamentally different in character from the rapid runoff produced by rainfall. Snowmelt percolates more slowly through the soil and peat than rainwater does, its rate of release moderated by temperature and by the structural properties of the snowpack itself, which acts as a reservoir holding water in solid form and releasing it gradually over days and weeks. This slow-release mechanism moderates the flooding and drought cycles of highland rivers and lochs, sustaining water levels through the drier spring months and contributing to the remarkable stability of water quality in lochs fed primarily by snowmelt from clean, uncontaminated high ground. The reed bed in winter has reduced itself to its most essential form. The pale, bleached stems that remained standing through late autumn have been further thinned by the storms of the past weeks, and the bed now presents a more open, skeletal structure than it did even a month ago, vertical stems still numerous enough to provide cover and habitat, but spaced more widely. The spaces between them filled with the horizontal tangle of fallen material that covers much of the water surface in the marginal zone. Through these gaps in the standing stems, the loch is visible from the cottage in ways that the full summer growth conceals entirely, and the effect is of the two spaces, cottage and loch, being in more direct communication with each other than in the warmer months, the reed bed serving as a screen rather than a wall. The bearded tit, known in Scotland also as the bearded reedling, is one of the few bird species that remains within the reed bed throughout the winter rather than retreating to more sheltered habitats as temperatures fall. Small, long-tailed, and colored in warm tawny and gray tones that render them almost invisible within the pale winter reed stems, bearded tits have developed a remarkable adaptation to winter survival that sets them apart from most other small songbirds. In autumn, as the reed bed's insect population declines towards zero with the cold, these birds undergo a fundamental change in their digestive anatomy. Their gizzards, the muscular organ used to grind food, actually enlarge and thicken over the course of a few weeks, transforming the bird from a soft-bodied insect specialist in summer to an efficient seed processor in winter, capable of digesting the hard seeds of reed and other wetland plants that would be inaccessible to the summer version of the same bird. This seasonal remodeling of internal organs has no equivalent in any other British bird species. The cold has changed the behavior of the water itself in ways that are visible to careful observation. At the very margins of the loch, where the water is shallowest and most exposed to the night air, a thin skim of ice has formed during the coldest hours before dawn. It is not thick enough to bear any weight and will be gone within an hour of the sun reaching the water's surface, but its presence represents a threshold moment, the point at which the water temperature has dropped sufficiently for freezing to occur at the margins. When a Highland loch begins to ice at its edges, it is not simply becoming cold. It is sorting itself chemically. As water freezes, it expels dissolved salts and organic compounds from its crystal lattice, concentrating them in the remaining liquid water. The ice that forms at the loch margin is therefore purer than the water from which it formed, and the water immediately beneath and around it is fractionally more concentrated in dissolved materials than it was before freezing began. Inside the cottage, the fire this morning was lit before first light. There is a practicality to winter fire management in a Highland stone cottage that has its own rhythm and logic. The fire must be established early enough to begin warming the thermal mass of the walls before the coldest part of the morning, and it must be fed consistently enough to maintain the temperature once the walls have reached their working warmth. A Highland cottager of any previous century would have understood this rhythm instinctively, would have felt it in the temperature of the room and the behavior of the fire with the unconscious accuracy of someone who has grown up in a building that communicates its thermal state directly and without ambiguity. The relationship between a person and a stone cottage in winter is, in this sense, a reciprocal one, the person managing the fire with attention and care, the building responding by holding and distributing the warmth with a fidelity that no modern heating system quite replicates. The brown trout have slowed. This is perhaps the most significant change in the loch's observable life through the winter months, and it happens by degrees rather than all at once, a gradual reduction in surface activity, in the frequency of rises, in the number and size of leaps that break the mirror of the winter loch. As water temperature falls below 8 degrees Celsius, the metabolic rate of brown trout decreases substantially, reducing their energy requirements and consequently their need to feed. Fish that were rising several times an hour in the active weeks of autumn may now feed only intermittently, on days when conditions align favorably. A slight warming of the surface layer, a hatch of hardy winter midges, a period of barometric stability that triggers feeding behavior even in cold conditions. The trout are not dormant. They are simply operating at a reduced tempo, conserving the energy that the cold water and long winter nights demand be conserved. The highland landscape surrounding the loch has entered its period of minimum biological activity, but minimum is not zero, and the winter loch is far from lifeless. Beneath the surface, the cold-adapted invertebrate communities that form the base of the food web continue their slow work. The stonefly larvae that cling to the undersides of loch bed stones are actually most active in the coldest months, having evolved specifically to exploit the cold water niche that most species vacate. Stonefly larvae in Highland lochs can take up to 3 years to complete their development from egg to adult, spending these years in the cold, well-oxygenated water beneath stones and within the substrate, where the consistency of the cold environment suits their slow, patient biology. When they finally emerge as adults in late winter or early spring, sometimes crawling across snow to reach a suitable mating site, they represent the first pulse of emergent season abundance that the trout and birds have been waiting months to exploit. The deer that have been moving off the high ground through the late autumn have now completed this seasonal descent, and the hillsides closest to the loch carry more red deer in winter than at any other time of year. Hinds and their followers occupy the lower ground in group configurations that provide collective warmth and collective vigilance against the weather and predators, while mature stags tend to hold slightly apart, their greater body mass giving them better cold tolerance and reducing the need for the social thermoregulation that the smaller-bodied hinds rely on. On the hillside above the cottage, a group of 8 hinds has been visible since first light, moving slowly across the lower slope in that characteristic deer way, a few steps, a pause, a lowering of the head to graze, another few steps, leaving a trail of dark slots in the frost-whitened grass that marks their path across the hill with the legibility of a written record. The osprey that fished this loch through the summer is long gone, back in West Africa, where it will spend the next several months in a landscape of warmth and abundant fish before something in its ancient migratory programming turns it north again in spring. Its absence is a winter fixture as reliable as the presence of the goldeneye and the tufted ducks. The Loch keeps its seasonal population with the consistency of a place that knows exactly what belongs to each part of the year and maintains those distinctions with a fidelity that no human schedule could match. The osprey will return to within days of the same date it arrived last year, and the year before, drawn back by an internal calendar of extraordinary precision to a loch it will recognize from the air by its shape and its color and the particular way its mist lies on still cold mornings. The fire in the cottage burns steadily. The frost on the window glass has formed overnight into the fern-like crystalline patterns that appear when moisture freezes on cold glass, each crystal a branch, each branch sub-branching in the same self-similar pattern, following the same mathematical rules of growth that govern the shape of river deltas and the branching of trees and the structure of lungs. The same geometry, repeated at every scale, in every medium, in every part of the natural world. The window holds this temporary, intricate art for as long as the glass remains cold, and then, as the fire's warmth reaches the glass from the inside, the frost retreats from the edges inward, the patterns dissolving from their margins, and the loch outside becomes visible again, the pale, still, winter loch, its surface holding the white sky above, the snow-dusted hills, the skeletal reeds, and somewhere beneath its cold, dark, patient surface, the trout waiting for the spring. The light returns before anything else does. This is always the way of it in the Highlands, the light leads, and the rest of the world follows at its own pace, in its own time, without being hurried. It comes back by increments so small that on any individual day the change is imperceptible, but across the weeks of January and into February the accumulation of those increments becomes undeniable. The afternoons last a little longer. The mornings arrive a little earlier. The angle of the sun above the southern horizon at noon climbs by fractions of a degree with each passing week, and the quality of the light, that particular flat, cool luminosity of the Highland winter, begins to acquire a warmth at its edges that was entirely absent through December. It is not spring. It is not even the suggestion of spring. But it is the suggestion of the suggestion, and in a landscape as attuned to the annual cycle of light as this one, even that is enough to begin changing things. The loch is the first to register the shift. Water is a remarkable recorder of seasonal change, its surface temperature, its color, its biological activity all responding to the slowly increasing light energy reaching it through the short winter days with a sensitivity that the land, insulated by soil and vegetation, cannot match. By late January, the loch surface has begun to warm by fractions of a degree above its midwinter minimum, and this fractional warming is enough to begin stirring the upper layers of the water column in ways that will, over the coming weeks, build toward the full spring turnover, the mixing event in which the distinct thermal layers that developed through the previous year are disrupted and redistributed, resetting the loch's chemistry and carrying oxygenated surface water down to the depths that have been sealed beneath the thermocline since the previous autumn. The spring turnover of a stratified Highland loch is one of the most ecologically significant events in the annual calendar of any standing water body, yet it is entirely invisible from the surface. As the water temperature approaches 4 degrees Celsius, the temperature at which water reaches its maximum density, the surface layer becomes dense enough to sink through the layers below it, initiating a circulation that progressively mixes the entire water column. Nutrients that have accumulated in the cold, still bottom waters through the winter months are brought to the surface, where light is available to drive photosynthesis, and the result is a pulse of biological productivity that cascades through the food web, feeding the algae that feed the invertebrates that feed the juvenile fish that feed everything above them. The turning of a loch in spring is, in the most literal sense, the moment the year begins. The reeds are already responding to the lengthening light in ways that are visible only at the very base of the bed, where last year's fallen stems are beginning to be threaded through by the first green shoots of the new season. These shoots, pale, almost translucent at their tips, pushing up through the mat of dead material with a persistence that seems disproportionate to their fragility, are among the earliest signs of biological renewal at the Lochside, appearing weeks before any other plant in the marginal zone shows signs of life. The reed's ability to begin its spring growth while air temperatures are still regularly below freezing is a function of the thermal properties of the loch bed itself. The sediment in which the rhizome network is embedded remains several degrees warmer than the air above, insulated by the water column above it, and this submerged warmth is enough to trigger growth in a plant whose root system is adapted to exploit precisely this thermal advantage. The cottage has been occupied through the winter by the same pair of house sparrows that nest each year in a gap between the chimney stack and the slating, using a crevice whose position suggests it has been a sparrow address for considerably longer than any human record of the building survives to confirm. House sparrows are among the most intimately associated wild birds with human habitation of any species in Britain. Their scientific name, Passer domesticus, acknowledges this dependency directly, and the fossil record indicates that the species has been living in close association with human settlements in Europe for at least 11,000 years. Since the earliest permanent agricultural villages provided the grain stores and structural cavities that the birds exploited as food sources and nesting sites. A cottage without sparrows is, in a subtle but real sense, a cottage that something is missing from. The mist this morning carries a quality it has not had since the early segments of this story, a lightness, an almost luminous quality, as though it has been reminded of what it can do in good conditions rather than merely what is required of it in the grey middle of winter. It lies on the loch's surface in the familiar way, rising in slow ribbons where the first light catches it, but the ribbons are brighter than they have been for months and the sky above them, pale and clear, has a blue to it, faint, provisional, not yet the confident blue of spring but a suggestion of it, present in the upper atmosphere like a memory of warmth that the season has not yet made good on. The mist moves through this early blue light with a grace that seems, on a morning like this one, almost deliberate, as though the loch has been waiting through the long winter months for the conditions to be right and is now, quietly, and without fuss, showing what it has always been capable of. The first oystercatcher of the returning season passed over the loch 2 days ago, heading north along the valley, its loud, piping call carrying down to the cottage from a height at which the bird itself was barely visible, a small black and white shape against the pale sky, calling continuously as though announcing its return not to any particular audience but to the landscape itself. Oystercatchers are among the earliest returning migrants to the Highland interior, arriving weeks before the swallows and martins, weeks before the ospreys, bringing with them the first audible evidence that the year has genuinely turned. Their call is one of those sounds that carries, for anyone who knows the Highland spring, a disproportionate emotional charge, not because of anything intrinsic to the sound itself but because of what it means, the accumulated associations of many seasons in which that call has been the first reliable signal that the winter is behind rather than ahead. The brown trout have been active this morning in a way they have not been for months. 3 rises in the last half hour, not the concentrated feeding of a full summer evening rise, but deliberate, considered surfacings, each one leaving a ring on the mirror still water that spreads and flattens and is absorbed by the margins in the unhurried way of rings on a windless morning. The fish are responding to the first significant hatch of large dark olives, upwing flies of the genus Betes that are among the earliest aquatic insects to emerge in the Highland spring, their appearance on the water's surface as reliable an indicator of improving conditions as any instrument. The trout that take them are not feeding with the urgency of autumn, but with a deliberateness that suggests they are fully aware that this is the beginning of something rather than the middle or the end, that the season of abundance is still ahead, and that there is no need to rush. The alder trees along the northern shore, which shed their nitrogen-rich leaves into the loch in autumn and have stood bare and dark through the winter months, are carrying their first catkins. The male catkins, long, drooping structures in a deep reddish purple that will extend and yellow as they mature and release their pollen, appeared first, weeks ago in fact, when everything else on the shore was still locked in winter stillness. The alder is wind-pollinated, releasing its pollen before its leaves open so that the pollen can travel freely through the bare woodland rather than being intercepted by foliage, and the timing of this release is triggered not by warmth but by day length, by the same increasing light that is warming the loch's surface and stirring the first reed shoots in the marginal sediment. The alder reads the same signal as everything else at the lochside and responds in its own way, on its own schedule, contributing its part to the annual resurrection of the place.